Welcome to That's Inclusive, where we talk about disability and what it means to live a full life engaging in our communities. What does that look like, and how can we work together to make our world a more inclusive place?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to That's Inclusive. My name is Isadora Rodriguez-Legendre. I'm the Executive Director at the New Hampshire Council on Developmental Disabilities. And I'm here today with Ernesto Burden, who does a number of things, especially around diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And we're very interested in learning more about his work and what drives him and how it aligns with our vision of disability inclusion. Welcome, Ernesto.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I usually like people to just introduce themselves, tell our listeners a little bit about you and the work that you do.
Sure. I am the publisher of New Hampshire Magazine, New Hampshire Business Review, 603 Diversity, which I think we're going to talk about in a little while. New Hampshire Home, New Hampshire Bride. We host a number of events. In general, we are the New Hampshire Group, which is a subset of the broader Yankee publishing operation. The Yankee, obviously Yankee Magazine, the Old Farmer's Almanac, these really iconic brands. So it's we're happy to be a part of that. And I'm responsible for all of the New Hampshire brands, the ones that I mentioned first. And so I manage that as a publisher, and not everybody, I think, knows what that is anymore.
Right.
Everybody knows what the editor does. The publisher is essentially the manager of the rest of the managers and manages the business, like a CEO or, Anyway.
Yeah, and your company actually used to work with us on Stepping Stones magazine, which is a resource guide for people with lived experience of disability. So I know that you are familiar with some of the things that we've done, and you probably have some questions about some of our work currently that we can definitely dive into.
Absolutely. As you and I have talked in the past, I think one of the things that's been really great is how much what you're able to share has been able to inform what we should be doing with the 603 Diversity magazine from disabilities perspective, which I don't think is the first thing that people think about. And it's an interesting challenge when you're thinking about doing a magazine about diversity anyway,
right.
is what does that entail? Because in some ways it entails everything. Like every one of us is this sort of plethora of diversities, right, in terms of our social background,
sure,
our religious beliefs, our
all the intersections of our identities, right, and how they play on each other and form these very unique people who now are walking around with other people who have their own unique perspectives. And we call that a community, right? And we have to kind of figure out how to work together and how not to offend each other, right? And not to trigger, for example, our traumas and our or trigger oppression in any way, shape, or form that can perpetuate kind of stigmas and inequities that exist in society. So I definitely appreciate that. And I think we were talking about how with 603 Diversity magazine, I had appreciated the openness to including accessibility and addressing diversity as part of that, of addressing disability as part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is something that we are actively, continuously trying to drive to communities that are working in DEI spaces. So I definitely appreciate that. Not only did the magazine highlight disability in some issues, but that really it seems like you're much more conscious of that inclusion piece in all of the work that you do.
Well, I mean, one of the things that comes out of a magazine culture is that we are, I hope, storytellers. Yeah. And in order to do that, I think you have to pay attention and see things, and typically not always things from your perspective. So I'm always grateful that like when you reached out, and I have a copy of the essay that you wrote for the magazine, a couple issues back, which was great. I actually underlined some things that I want to share later, but one of the things that we knew right out of the gate when we launched the magazine is that we would not get everything right. I'm not even sure there are right answers to how to do what we're trying to do with this. So it had to be, we had to go into it comfortable that our intentions were good, but that we were going to misstep, like not mention something we should, or mention something that we shouldn't, or something. And it's interesting that you had mentioned just now the care that we take as the culture moves forward to be empathetic and thoughtful and careful about how we treat other people and about not triggering people's traumas and that sort of thing. In addition to that, because I think all that's right, but then there's also a piece where I feel like we also have to look at our reactions and try and react to things as though people, even when they make mistakes, are making mistakes with the best of intentions, or I'm not sure if I'm saying it well, but just, that idea, if everybody started from a baseline of, I'm going to be really careful, but also you were going to give me the benefit of the doubt that even if I said something that might have hurt you, I didn't mean to.
Yeah.
And then you're going to instruct me and just let me know. You know?
To come from a place of presuming good intentions.
Right.
And I think that is so important in our work, where we're really, we're all in it for the same reason. We all want to see a better world, right, than we came into, or trying to make the world a better place in some way, shape, or form, whether it's sharing information or creating systems that support people the way they need to be supported, or building the capacity to really have people participate in a meaningful way that have been excluded in the past. I think that we have to presume that we all are coming from a good place, and we're going to have missteps along the way, and that's just reality.
Right, and I think that allows the conversation to happen. And I mean, maybe not everybody's coming from a good place. Sometimes people are just mean, but it's but I think a lot of times people are, and I think that to have a conversation, everybody needs to feel comfortable enough in that conversation to be willing to misstep. Yeah. And because otherwise you don't talk at all.
Yes. You have to be willing. And, I've talked to you a little bit about my anxiety and my kind of overcoming my own, I guess, feelings of inadequacy. And I think that is so true, and it makes it okay to not know everything, right? It makes it okay to come from a place of curiosity and to say, tell me more about that, or I didn't see that perspective before, but now I can consider it as part of, the information that I'm using to make a decision. And I think that's so important for people to just not be the experts all the time.
Well, yeah, I think it's well, not only is it important, but not to say anything too forcefully controversial, but it feels like the only right perspective to me in that I don't know. Most of the time, if I've met people who've been absolutely 100% confident of their every opinion, they're usually wrong about everything.
Right.
And of course, that now I'll nerd out a little bit and say that reminds me, you always get into a bind when you start making statements like that, right? Because if I said everybody who's 100% sure of everything or says that they know something absolutely for certain is absolutely wrong. Well, I just said I know something absolutely for certain, which is that thing. It's like that line in one of the Star Wars movies where I think it was Yoda or something said, only a Sith deals in absolutes. And everybody, of course, pointed out that's kind of an absolute statement.
No, that's awesome. So tell me a little bit more about 603 Diversity and kind of how it came to be and what you hoped to accomplish with the magazine.
Well, this was this launched in that post summer of 2020, and one of the things that was happening everywhere was that companies were making diversity statements.
Yes.
And sometimes they seemed really well-intentioned and good, and sometimes they seemed a little bit like lip service. But what occurred to me was that the risk was always either saying more than you meant or should say on behalf of a company that's made up of a whole bunch of diverse people itself, or not saying enough. And so the risk was that you end up with a very anodyne statement that doesn't really say anything other than we're good.
Yeah.
So we thought that it would be good to put out something that rather than making our statement about how we felt about things, we wanted to put out something that made a statement on behalf of the communities that we were talking to and about, and let them say what they thought about things. We wanted essentially to create representation.
Yeah, I really think that you've done that, having seen a lot of the pieces and the contributors. Really, there's, like you said, they're telling their story, and it really has an impact, right? Because we can feel that connection, and then also recognize the sometimes unique experiences that people are having while we're all here making our built-in assumptions, right, that we walk around with every day, and how it's just important to kind of lift that veil sometimes and remember that people come from different experiences, different backgrounds, and it's important to recognize that and celebrate it, and really have that warm, I want to say, invitation. I always talk about that in disability inclusion, is that, being a champion of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility isn't just about saying those things and creating spaces that are accessible. It's also about creating a feeling of welcoming, a feeling of belonging, right? And that's kind of like an extra step that a lot of businesses, a lot of agencies forget to include in their work. It's not just about changing your mission statement and like making a declaration. It's about how do we actually make people feel like they belong.
I've noticed that's been added to a lot of those to a lot of DEI mission statements. It's now DEIB, right?
Right.
How do you think that people are made to feel to belong? Because I mean that from a perspective of somebody in a leadership role in a business, that it almost seems like they're everybody is so unique that what does make somebody feel belong, and maybe there are really obvious ones, like you listen to people,
right. Right, you ask them what they think, and you reflect their input in your actions, right? And that is one of the biggest ways that we can say, hey, we're listening, and what you're telling us is important, and we're going to make a change based on that. I think that's one of the biggest ways that we can do that.
Is it what are some others, especially within the disabilities community?
So I think in the disabilities community, it's really important to seek out information because not everyone with an intellectual or developmental disability is really able to communicate or explain kind of the nuances in behavior or what their needs are in terms of sensory overload needs, right? So we have gotten in the habit, for example, of including in our conference planning and collaborations, make sure that we're having sensory safe spaces. So if someone is just overwhelmed, either visually or auditorially, they can check out. They can go to a quiet room with maybe dim lights and just reset. And that's so important to helping people who have sensory differences feel like they belong in those spaces, because now you're intentionally including supports that they need to be able to stay for the whole day, right? Which didn't really happen in the past. So things like that, things like making sure parade routes are accessible for wheelchair users, things like that. It's really informing yourself about what some of the needs of people with disabilities might have, even if they're not able to communicate that effectively. And so another thing that we've gotten in the habit of doing is offering ASL interpreter grants for different events and activities so that people who are deaf and hard of hearing can also feel like they belong in that event or activity, because they'll be able to now understand or the speeches that are being delivered in that event. Right. So it's those little things. It's really kind of educating yourself about what the different support needs might be of a person with a disability and just building that in without asking.
And is getting that information out a big part of the challenge? Because it seems like if just thinking logistically about the example you just gave, you have a grant go towards providing somebody to do ASL translation for an event, but people need to know that event has that, right. And I mean, they don't have to know to show up at it, but maybe there are people who would show up if they knew. But how do you make people more aware? And that maybe goes back a little bit, to the point of this magazine and even the work that we're doing in our broader magazines. I shouldn't I shouldn't leave them out. Because we, as a company, both our New Hampshire group and Yankee more broadly, and the Old Farmer's Almanac have spent a lot of time talking about what inclusion looks like in the pages of our other magazines as well.
Yeah, and I think that going back to how we started, it's about asking the question. It's about making sure that in conference registrations or in event development, that you are putting something out there, some sort of statement that says, if there is some sort of support that you would think would improve your experience at this event or this activity, let us know. That we're open to hearing what your needs might be for making this an inclusive, welcoming space for you. And so you'll see it a lot now these days in conference registrations. At the bottom, it'll say, do you have any accessibility needs? If so, let us know what they are, and we will try our best to accommodate those, right? And so I think asking those questions whenever we can, when we're planning different events and activities, is really creating that sense of, oh, they do want to hear what my needs are, and they're willing to accommodate that.
I think that's great. I'm actually, people listening can't see, but you can see that I'm writing that down. That feels like a thing that we could do. That's not it's not difficult. It's not expensive. It's just can go right into a post-event survey and say were there things you needed, or that you could have used.
Right. How could this conference have been more accessible for you, or more felt more welcoming for you? And that could include beyond disability, right? Something that someone might have needed, whether it's language translation or materials in different languages. I think that it's really easy to forget that someone's experience is really going to be impacted by not having the support that they need to be able to engage the same way as other people.
What are some things that come to mind when you think about storytelling that could help to illustrate that?
Yeah, so storytelling in the disability community is one of the biggest vehicles that we have to really send our messages and drive our messages home, especially to folks that don't have a connection to disability. So I think that stories are so important. One of the things that we are doing at the Caregivers Conference, which is coming up next month, is we're supporting one of our council members to collect video stories. She does a lot of advocacy work, and especially in different types of media. She's one of the co-producers of this podcast. Her name is Patricia Vincent Piet, and she is a person with lived experience of disability. Her husband also has a developmental disability. And so it is so important to have folks that have that lived experience share their stories and help people who don't have that connection understand how meaningful it is when they're included, when they're thought of, when they're asked, right? Those important questions of what is it that you need.
Is there a follow-on to that where people with lived experience share those experiences, but then people who live with those people with lived experiences? There was a TED Talk, TEDx talk in Lowell that I jotted this quote down from because I thought it was really relevant to the storytelling ideas. Have you ever heard of somebody named Becky Curran? Mm-hmm. She's a motivational speaker professionally, I think, and a little person. And she was giving this talk, and she was talking about, she worked in film out in Los Angeles for a while. I hope I'm getting that right because I didn't write that part down. So if she worked in film somewhere else, I think it was Los Angeles. Anyway, she worked in the media, in movies. And there was somebody that was a high-level executive in the organization she was at who it turned out had grown up with somebody with a serious disability in terms of mobility. And she said of him, as she closed this talk, she said, he had a disability story, but not anybody else in the company knew that story. I want more people to be able to hear these stories so we can all realize we can relate in more ways than we think we can. We're all on this earth together, and we all want to be a part of it and just be appreciated and accepted. And I thought that was a great sort of way to get it. Again, what we're trying to do with 603 Diversity as a magazine is and as a storytelling device.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're trying to do at the Caregivers Conference, because it's all about both unpaid and paid caregivers who, we have parents that are getting older that may need supports and may develop disabilities as they get older. We have, family members that, may have an accident, and all of a sudden now, if someone breaks a leg, at least temporarily, they're going to need additional supports from their family, from their loved ones, their friends, their community. And so really understanding that disability is a natural part of the human experience, and that we all can have at one point or another a connection to disability, including ourselves and our loved ones. And so understanding that does connect us in a lot of ways, even if we don't think of it that way. We don't think of people kind of who aren't born with a disability, living without a disability for their whole life, right? But that's the reality, is we all experience some form of disability at some point in our lives and have connections to loved ones and family members that we can recognize, and that we can take a look at the world and say, oh, wow, this really isn't accessible for them or for me in this current situation. We really need to be looking more at universal design in every space, so that no matter if it's a disability or, a single mom with a stroller, we use that analogy for universal design, is that when you create spaces that are accessible for people with disabilities, you're actually creating spaces that are accessible for everyone. Older adults, someone who develops a walking disability, someone who has a visual or hearing impairment, and that actually makes the community come together and recognize that we have more in common than we have different.
What kind of pushback do you get when you're talking about that? Because I can imagine that there's an argument that somebody might make that, a sort of ad absurdum argument, like how universal could you possibly make things? One of those.
Sure.
And of course, it also occurs to me that the flip side response to that argument would be, well, we could just put a rope, and anybody who's strong enough to climb it, just surely through upper body strength, is the only one who's welcome to come in. But I don't know. But does that happen, that sort of ad absurdum? Well, if I don't know.
I think more often than not, what we see is sheer denial. That's never going to happen to me, or I don't have that experience, so I can't put myself in someone else's shoes. And really, until you have that personal connection, sometimes is that Mack truck in your face is like, oh yeah, that means me too, right? I guess I'm not excluded when we talk about potentially people having a disability or a connection to disability in some way, shape, or form. So a lot of our storytelling is driven around that, is driven around just educating and informing people that, we need to look to each other to be able to get the examples of what we could be facing in the future. So, and I'm a person who, my parents are getting older, and so I start seeing that they have different needs. And so I recognize that, especially in New Hampshire, where you have to drive everywhere, that's not really, for an older adult who is no longer able to drive, how are they accessing the community now? And what are the resources available to them? And so thinking about it in those terms sometimes helps someone come around to the it's not just about disability. It's accessibility is about accessibility for everyone who just has a different need, right? At any different time in their life.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I do think it again kind of underscores the need for and the power of storytelling, because a lot of times, you said denial, and that's something I think you run up against in all kinds of DEI type sure. situations. And I know with the magazine, some of the, I get criticism in the form of letters and emails and stuff, mostly letters. often with no return address, but occasionally
How convenient.
with return. Well, when we first put this out, somebody ripped up a copy and put it in a mailer and sent it to me. But a lot of the pushback, and I try and I guess try and think about what's happening, with somebody who has that kind of reaction to it. And, and some of it is that denial. I've got a very specific example would be more than one letter writer has written saying there is no racism in New Hampshire. And so by putting this magazine out, you're creating it by being divisive. And I am happy for them that they've never experienced it.
Yeah.
Or maybe they live in a place that's so homogeneous that that doesn't happen. But the practical lived experience of a lot of people would counteraindicate that. But I could write back and say, oh, there absolutely is. Here's what the statistics show. Here are the hate crime statistics. Or here are people's personal stories. Here's my personal story. Right. But that's not going to change anybody's mind. Like facts, arguments are, I think you need to have them. But what seems to really change people's mind is I think you have to change people's heart first, mind follows. And this isn't unique to me. I'm trying to remember who said it. Maybe it was the business writer Simon Sinek who wrote The Power of Why or something. But I think there was an example in that book where he was talking about we usually make decisions based on our gut or our heart, and then we rationalize them intellectually.
That makes sense.
And that's why it's so hard to argue somebody out of a position with facts.
Right.
Like if you've ever sat and just tried to have a fact-based argument with somebody, nobody ever backs down.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say nobody. That's only a Sith would say nobody.
Right. The experts.
Yeah. But you can go back and forth all day, and you see it like this is how arguments on the internet work.
Right.
As this is why I don't argue about anything on social media, because it's just one long string of people throwing their experts and their facts at the other person until the end of time, and nobody ever changes their mind. I think that stories can change people's minds.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great takeaway just from this conversation. And again, I think in the disability community, we've really found that helping people get over their particular hump or their particular firewall to understanding what someone's needs are or what a disability issue is by people telling their stories of adversity, of overcoming obstacles, of the systems that exist that continue to exclude them from, civic engagement, from community participation, from all of those things, from schools, right? From learning. And we've talked about learning before and how important it is that people have educators that really believe in their ability and who come from a strength-based perspective of learning, right? And I think so much of our educational system doesn't do that and kind of puts people in these boxes. But I think we're going to start to wrap up, and I wondered if you had any other takeaways or any other hopes for what some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you're doing is going to accomplish here in New Hampshire and how we can help.
Well, some of the things we hope, obviously, we hope that the magazine is going to continue to be able to provide representation, because I do think that that's important and is, unless I think representation is important and often not. I don't think it's understood well. If somebody hasn't experienced it in a parallel way. I think everybody has probably experienced not being represented and not belonging across the board. And I think this is part of the reason I think it's important to share stories in general, not just in this magazine, but storytelling is such a powerful thing that as people begin to tell their stories, they do find how much in common they have, regardless of their background, and regardless of which community they come from or anything else. But there's this idea of representation, whether it's ethnic or racial or the disability community. It's important to see yourself in media, in stories. And one of the other criticisms that we've gotten, I'll tell you all the criticisms, and they're all interesting points, right? There's I got a letter that said, why do you have to do this separate magazine? Why don't you just put diverse people in your main magazines? And we do. Right. But the answer to that question, as I was rereading the column you wrote for us, I saw something that I thought really eloquently sort of gave an answer to that. You said, when I moved to New Hampshire, it was harder to find, quote, my people. There is far less cultural and linguistic diversity visible in our state, so I had to intentionally seek out spaces where people were celebrating their cultures and identities. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do here is not create a rift, but to point out something that the community in general might not be aware of. Like if you go outside of New Hampshire has a reputation for not being diverse. Right. So in some places it has a reputation for being intolerant. I don't think that it lacks diversity, and I don't think that the state lacks tolerance. I think it doesn't get those aspects of things pointed out enough. And so I think a vehicle like 603 Diversity is a good tool for providing representation for diverse communities in the state, but also for letting people know outside the state, including businesses that might want to move here, including people who might want to move here to work, including young people who we would like to stay here as opposed to leave to go someplace more diverse. That this diversity already does exist in the state. And so that's, we have the opportunity to showcase that. So I think it's good for the culture. I think it's good for business. I think it's good, for both of those things. So.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I want to just echo that, including people with disabilities in discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion adds to that, right? And it adds to the visibility of that being part of our landscape in New Hampshire, and of this being a potential untapped workforce, for example, that more businesses need to explore, that it's important that we take into consideration, like we were talking about, what their needs are in order to be contributing productive members of society, which is what everyone wants.
Yeah, well, I look forward to talking more about this. I know, we've talked about our next New Hampshire Business Review has done a DEI from Talk to Action series of morning seminars over the past couple of years that have talked about the impact of DEI in business and on business, and you and I have talked about the next one really having a focus on disabilities and the opportunity that exists there for both the disability community, but also for the businesses that are struggling to find workers right now.
Absolutely. I think it's a huge pool of untapped resources in our state, and that everyone would benefit from just being more inclusive in their hiring practices and having some, built-in supports and services for people who can do a good job, right? And just might need a little help to be able to do that. Well, thank you so much for coming. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I look forward to working with you in the future, and especially looking forward to the DEI Talk to Action focus on disability next year. Thanks again for coming.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Vanessa Blaze, and this was a production of the New Hampshire Council on Developmental Disabilities, produced by Isadora Rodriguez-Legendre and Vanessa Blaze, with many thanks to Josh Hardy and the rest of the crew here at Concord TV. We love to have guests with differing perspectives. These views are personal and do not necessarily represent those of the DD Council.